Sarah Bellamy, Daniel Hart, and Sheriff Nolan Carter, three names that would forever be linked by a shocking murder that tore apart the quiet town of Ravenswood. Sarah, the young school teacher with a dark past. Daniel, the obsessive man whose love turned to deadly obsession. And Carter, the seasoned sheriff determined to uncover the truth. What began as a peaceful town suddenly became the stage for a chilling tale of obsession, revenge, and the deadly consequences of running from the past. Ravenswood had always been a town where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen. Nestled among the rolling hills, it was a place where neighbors knew each other by name, and the calm, cool air in the mornings seemed to carry with it the promise of safety and peace. The locals took comfort in their small, quiet routines, and the thought of anything disruptive was laughable. The most exciting events were the seasonal fairs and the occasional football game. Crime, let alone murder, was something they only saw on TV. The town had a reputation for being untouched by the turmoil of the world. Sarah Bellamy had arrived in Ravenswood just 6 months earlier, and her move seemed to blend in seamlessly with the quiet life of the town. A school teacher in her late 20s, she had chosen Ravenswood for its serene atmosphere and small-town charm. A fresh start, she'd called it, a chance to leave behind the heartbreak of a messy breakup in the city and begin again. She rented a small house on the edge of town, a cozy place that felt like home the moment she stepped inside. Her neighbors often saw her walking into town with a gentle smile, always polite, always friendly. The students at Ravenswood High School admired her, and the other teachers spoke highly of her work ethic and warmth. But even in a town as quiet as Ravenswood, things are rarely as perfect as they seem. On the night of December 14th, the temperature dropped sharply, and a biting wind swept through the streets. The town felt even more isolated as the cold settled in, and most of the residents were already indoors, tucked away from the elements. Sarah had stayed late at the school that evening, grading papers and preparing for the next day's lesson. She hadn't planned on staying that long, but there was something about the quiet hum of the empty school that helped her concentrate. It was a peaceful escape from the noise of the world. By midnight, the school building was dark and deserted, and Sarah, after finishing her work, decided to take the shortcut through the woods behind the school to get home. It was an old habit, one she had picked up during her time in the city, where she had often walked alone at night. She never minded the solitude, and the woods were familiar to her now, with their winding paths and the silence that enveloped them. But that night, as Sarah walked through the dark, a sense of unease settled over her. The wind rustled through the trees, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. It was as though something was waiting, watching from the darkness. She quickened her pace, her heart beginning to race as the sounds around her seemed to grow louder, more oppressive. Then, just as she neared the clearing at the edge of the woods, something happened. Sarah heard a rustling behind her, a step too soft to be footsteps but unmistakable. She stopped in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She turned around, scanning the woods for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the blackness and the wind. Unable to shake the feeling of being watched, Sarah hurried out of the woods and onto the familiar road that led to her house. But as she crossed the street and started up her driveway, something else caught her eye. There, at the edge of the woods, standing motionless under the pale moonlight, was a figure. Before she could react, a chill shot through her, and the figure disappeared into the trees, leaving nothing but the sound of the wind behind. Sarah quickly entered her house, locking the door behind her, and tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that clung to her. But she couldn't. Something wasn't right. The next morning she was found dead in those same woods. The scene was eerily calm, with no signs of a struggle. The only thing that remained was the chilling question who would want to hurt Sarah, and why. Ravenswood was never the same after that night, its perfect calm shattered by a murder that no one saw coming. The discovery of Sarah Bellamy's body shocked the town of Ravenswood to its core. What had once been a place of tranquility was now a crime scene, and the peaceful community was left reeling. Sheriff Nolan Carter, a man who had served as the town's lawman for over 20 years, was the first to respond to the call. He arrived at the woods early that morning, his boots crunching the frost-covered ground as he made his way through the trees. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air, and the stillness of the scene only deepened the sense of unease that settled over him. Sarah's body lay in the clearing, her lifeless form a stark contrast to the beauty of the forest around her. There was no sign of a struggle. No blood, no broken branches, no indication that anything violent had occurred. It was as if she had simply collapsed where she stood. But that couldn't be the case. She had been murdered. The precise wound to her chest confirmed it. A small, clean cut, too deliberate to be a random act of violence. Carter surveyed the area, his mind racing. He had seen his fair share of crime scenes, but nothing like this. Ravenswood had always been a place where people left their doors unlocked, where neighbors shared meals, and where the worst trouble was a late-night noise complaint. The sheriff had always believed that the most he would ever deal with were petty thefts or the occasional drunken brawl. But a murder, this was something different. This was something he wasn't prepared for. As he continued to inspect the scene, Carter's team of investigators scoured the surrounding woods. There were no signs of footprints leading away from the body, no discarded weapon, no clue as to who could have done this. The silence was suffocating. The more they searched, the more it became clear whoever had killed Sarah had planned it carefully. There were no careless mistakes, no rush to leave the scene. It was as if the murderer had known exactly what they were doing. Back in the town, the news of Sarah's death spread quickly. The townspeople were horrified. Sarah had only been in Ravenswood for a few months, and during that time she had become a well-liked figure. She was the new school teacher, young and full of energy, with a friendly smile that put everyone at ease. There was no reason anyone could think of that would explain why someone would want to harm her. She hadn't been involved in any conflicts, nor had she shown any signs of being in danger. The school was the first place Carter turned to for answers. The staff and students were shocked and confused by Sarah's sudden death, and no one could provide any useful information. The teachers described Sarah as an excellent colleague, someone who got along well with everyone. The students adored her, and there were no reports of any problems or issues that might have pointed to a potential motive for murder. Even her closest friends and fellow teachers seemed stunned. No one had ever seen anything that might have indicated Sarah was involved in something dangerous or risky. Yet, as the days passed and the investigation continued, small fragments of information began to emerge. One of Sarah's students mentioned an unusual encounter she had seen between Sarah and an unidentified man a week before the murder. The student had been walking to her car when she overheard a heated argument between Sarah and a man in the school parking lot. It was brief, but the tension in the air had been palpable, the man's voice rising, while Sarah appeared to be trying to defuse the situation. The student couldn't hear exactly what was being said, but she distinctly remembered seeing the man's angry face. The description was vague, but it was a lead. Carter quickly interviewed the student, but she didn't know who the man was, only that he had seemed out of place. No one in town could identify him, and there were no records of anyone matching the description. As the investigation dug deeper into Sarah's past, it became clear that her life before moving to Ravenswood might hold the key to solving her murder. Carter and his team pulled her background files, trying to uncover anything that could explain why someone would target her. They learned that Sarah had been living in different cities for several years before coming to Ravenswood, always moving from place to place, seemingly trying to escape something. But whatever Sarah was running from, it remained a mystery. There were no obvious enemies, no criminal connections. It was as though the more they learned about her, the more questions arose. What had brought Sarah to Ravenswood? Who was the mysterious man in the parking lot? And most importantly, why had she been killed? The investigation was going nowhere fast, and with each passing day, the town grew more tense. The people of Ravenswood were no longer just scared, they were beginning to distrust each other. Everyone seemed to have a theory, and rumors started to spread like wildfire. But no one had any answers. As the clock ticked on, Sheriff Carter couldn't help but feel like he was running out of time to solve the case. The days following Sarah Bellamy's death were filled with tension. The peaceful town of Ravenswood, which had always prided itself on its tight-knit community and low crime rate, was now a place of suspicion. Neighbors eyed each other with wariness, as though everyone was suddenly a potential suspect. Sheriff Nolan Carter could feel the weight of the town's anxiety pressing down on him, but with each passing day, the investigation into Sarah's murder seemed to hit dead ends. Despite his best efforts, there was still no sign of a break in the case. Sarah's background was virtually spotless, with no signs of any history that would have suggested she was involved in anything dangerous. Her life in Ravenswood had been brief, but it had seemed normal. The people who knew her described a young woman eager to make a fresh start after a failed relationship in the city, and there were no indications that she had been hiding anything. Yet, Sheriff Carter couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone in town knew more than they were letting on. Every conversation he had with the townspeople seemed to reveal more questions than answers. Everyone he spoke to insisted they knew nothing, that Sarah was a sweet and harmless person, but Carter couldn't help but wonder if someone was withholding information. One evening, while reviewing the case files at his desk, Carter received a call that would send the investigation down an unexpected path. A man had checked into the Ravenswood Motel, the only place in town for out-of-town visitors. At first, there was nothing unusual about the guest. He had given a vague name, Daniel Hart, and had paid for his stay with cash. But what caught the sheriff's attention was the man's behavior. He never left the motel, and when he did step outside, he seemed to be looking around nervously, as if he was trying to avoid being seen. Carter immediately ordered his deputies to keep an eye on the motel. He was suspicious of the man. Something about him felt off. The sheriff knew the town's few visitors well, and there was no record of anyone named Daniel Hart having ever been to Ravenswood before. He also noticed that the man had checked in just a few days after Sarah's body was found, a timeline that seemed too coincidental to ignore. The following morning, Carter visited the motel and spoke to the clerk who had checked in the mysterious guest. The clerk didn't know much about the man, other than the fact that he hadn't interacted with anyone except for brief trips to the store. But Carter's gut told him that Daniel Hart was somehow connected to Sarah's death. The sheriff began asking around town, but no one recognized the name. There were no records of him ever having been in Ravenswood before. As the sheriff continued his investigation, he began to notice a pattern. The man had been seen in the vicinity of the high school on the day of Sarah's death. A few students reported seeing him hanging around near the parking lot, staring at the building for hours. But when Carter checked the surveillance footage, there was nothing. The camera footage was blurry and inconclusive, showing only a vague figure walking away from the school. It was enough to raise suspicion, but not enough to make an arrest. Carter's next step was to visit the man's motel room. When he arrived, he found the door slightly ajar, and there was no sign of Hart. The room had been left in a hurry, with items scattered on the bed, as though someone had abruptly packed and left. The sheriff searched the room carefully, finding nothing of real interest except for a photograph of Sarah, her face unmistakable. The picture was worn, as if it had been carried around for a long time, and there was no indication of when or where it had been taken. Carter immediately felt a chill run down his spine. It was clear that Hart knew Sarah, but how? And why had he been hiding in Ravenswood? The fact that Sarah had never mentioned him to anyone made the situation even more unsettling. As the sheriff's team dug deeper into Hart's background, they discovered a few troubling details. Daniel Hart was not from Ravenswood. In fact, he had no permanent address, moving from place to place, living off odd jobs and never staying in one town for too long. His criminal record was sparse but concerning small-time offenses, mostly thefts and misdemeanors, but nothing serious enough to draw attention. What struck Carter as most disturbing, however, was the fact that Hart's last known address was in a city where Sarah had lived before coming to Ravenswood. It was the same city where her previous relationship had ended in turmoil, the same city where she had supposedly left behind her past. Had Hart been following her? Was he somehow tied to her troubled relationship? Carter had a feeling that the key to solving this case lay not in Ravenswood, but in Sarah's past. But as he dug deeper, he realized that unraveling her life before moving here might bring him closer to understanding why she had been targeted. And it might lead him straight to the man hiding in plain sight, Daniel Hart. As Sheriff Carter delved deeper into Daniel Hart's background, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. The discovery of the photograph was the most significant clue he had found so far. It was a snapshot of Sarah Bellamy, clearly taken years ago, and it was tucked away in Hart's motel room. The photo was worn and faded, as though it had been carried around for years, held onto with obsessive care. But there were no other clues about how Hart and Sarah were connected, and neither the photograph nor Hart's criminal record provided enough evidence to make an arrest. Carter knew that he had to dig into Sarah's past to understand more about this mysterious connection. He contacted the school she had worked at before moving to Ravenswood, asking for any records or information about her. Her former colleagues were tight-lipped, but after some persistence, Carter managed to speak with a few people who had known Sarah well. One teacher mentioned that Sarah had always been private about her past, never discussing her previous relationships or the reasons behind her move to Ravenswood. But one detail stood out to Carter. There had been rumors of an abusive relationship. A few of her co-workers recalled overhearing conversations where Sarah had seemed distressed, speaking in hushed tones about a man she had left behind. But the name Daniel Hart didn't come up. It was only when Carter cross-referenced Sarah's past with police records from the city she had lived in that he found something of interest. Daniel Hart was known to the police, but only in relation to a string of petty crimes and disturbing behavior. However, there had been a domestic violence case involving him several years ago, a case that was eventually dropped due to lack of evidence. The victim had been Sarah Bellamy. Carter was stunned. This was the missing link he had been searching for. Sarah had never mentioned Hart's name to anyone in Ravenswood, but now it seemed clear that she had been running from him. She had tried to escape him, but it appeared that Hart had followed her here. Carter now had a motive: revenge. Daniel Hart had likely been stalking Sarah for years, obsessing over her, unable to let go of their past. The fresh start she had found in Ravenswood, the peaceful town she had hoped would heal her, had become the final chapter of a tragic story she had tried to leave behind. But Hart wouldn't let her go. He had followed her here, waited for the right moment, and then killed her. But there was one question that lingered: why kill her now, after all this time? Why wait until she had settled into a new life? Carter believed that Hart's obsession had only deepened after Sarah's move to Ravenswood. In the small town, she had been a stranger to most, and her life had been a blank slate. Hart may have thought that if he couldn't have her, no one else could. The thought of her starting over, living a life without him, may have triggered something in him. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that Hart had seen the murder as the final, twisted way to reclaim control over Sarah, to make sure she would never truly be free of him. Armed with this new information, Carter put a plan into motion. He had a name, a motive, and a photograph. It was time to find Daniel Hart and bring him in for questioning. But there was still one major problem: Hart had vanished. After his brief stay at the Ravenswood motel, he had disappeared without a trace. No one had seen him leave, and his whereabouts were unknown. It was as if he had simply melted into the shadows, just like the last time Sarah had tried to escape him. Carter contacted nearby police stations and sent out an alert for Hart. He also reached out to neighboring counties, asking for help in locating him. He couldn't afford to waste any more time. If Hart was on the move, there was a chance he would slip away forever. But Carter couldn't allow that to happen. He had to find him before he could disappear again, before Hart could hurt someone else. Days passed, and the pressure mounted. The town of Ravenswood, once so peaceful, was now consumed by fear. Every corner felt like a potential hiding spot for Daniel Hart, and every stranger who passed through the street seemed suspicious. The sense of safety that had once been the town's greatest charm had now been shattered. Then, one evening, as Carter was reviewing the case files once more, a call came through. The local police in the neighboring county had found a vehicle matching the description of Hart's. The car had been abandoned in a remote area just outside of town. It seemed like the break Carter had been waiting for. As he rushed to the scene, he could feel the tension building inside him. He was getting closer to finally solving the case and bringing Sarah's killer to justice. But as he stepped out into the cold night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hunt for Hart wasn't just about solving a crime. It was about ending a story that had dragged on for far too long, one that had twisted its way through Sarah's life and, now, through his own. Sheriff Carter arrived at the location where Daniel Hart's abandoned car had been found, his heart racing as he stepped out of his patrol car. The area was dark, bathed in the faint light from the moon, casting long shadows on the ground. The cold was biting, and the silence of the woods around him seemed deafening. He had the uneasy feeling that Hart was close, that he could be watching from the shadows, waiting to make his next move. The vehicle, a rusty old sedan, was parked on a dirt road that cut through the woods. There was no sign of a struggle or damage to the car, but it had been left with the keys in the ignition, which was odd. It suggested that Hart hadn't planned on abandoning it. The car seemed almost untouched, and Carter couldn't help but feel that it was a deliberate message, an invitation to follow, to come closer. Carter and his deputies began their search of the surrounding woods, moving cautiously, knowing that Hart was no stranger to evading capture. The trees around them creaked in the wind, and the ground was soft, making it difficult to find clear tracks. But the sheriff's instincts told him that Hart was close by. He wasn't just hiding, he was waiting. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. The sense of urgency now pushed Carter forward. He couldn't afford to let Hart slip away again. Hours passed without any sign of movement. As the search team spread out, Carter's frustration began to mount. The cold air seemed to seep into his bones, but it wasn't the chill that troubled him. It was the feeling of being so close to the end, yet unable to reach it. Then, as the first light of dawn broke through the trees, one of Carter's deputies called out to him. They had found something. In a small clearing not far from the car, they discovered a makeshift campsite. The area was disturbingly quiet, the fire long since gone cold. Carter's deputy pointed to the ground, where they had found a series of faint footprints leading toward a nearby ravine. The prints were fresh, the tread marks still visible, indicating that Hart had been there not long ago. It was a trail that would lead Carter to the end of the hunt. Carter and his team followed the trail, moving quickly but carefully. The ravine loomed ahead, a dark chasm between the trees. As they approached the edge, Carter saw a figure standing in the distance, barely visible against the rising light of the day. It was Hart. The man stood perfectly still, as though he had been waiting for this moment, knowing it would come. Carter's hand instinctively went to his holster, but he didn't draw his weapon just yet. This was it, the confrontation that would finally bring Sarah Bellamy's killer to justice. Hart had nowhere left to run. Daniel Hart, Carter called out, his voice firm, but there was a tension beneath the words. Hart didn't move. His face was half hidden in shadow, but Carter could see the faint glimmer of something in his eyes, a mixture of defiance and resignation. The moment stretched out, each second feeling like an eternity. "You're not going to get away this time," Carter said, his voice steady. "This ends now." For a long moment, there was no response. Then, in a soft, almost whispering voice, Hart spoke, his words carrying the weight of years of obsession and regret. "I never wanted it to be like this," he said. "She was mine. She belonged to me." Carter's gut twisted. The words made it clear that Hart had never let go of Sarah, that his twisted obsession had driven him to this. But it was too late for explanations. Carter knew what had to be done. He slowly approached Hart, his steps measured, his focus locked on the man who had killed Sarah. Suddenly, in one swift motion, Hart turned and bolted toward the ravine, his movements frantic. Without hesitation, Carter drew his weapon and shouted for Hart to stop. "Don't do it," he warned. "Come back. You don't have to end it this way." But Hart didn't listen. In his desperation, he scrambled toward the edge of the ravine, his legs unsteady. Carter rushed forward, but it was too late. With one final, panicked motion, Hart lost his footing and tumbled over the edge, disappearing into the darkness below. Carter stood frozen for a moment, the weight of what had just happened sinking in. He had been so close, so sure that he would bring Hart in alive. But in the end, the man had made his own decision. The sheriff could only watch as the echoes of Hart's fall faded into the distance. The search team arrived at the edge of the ravine moments later, but it was clear there was no need to go further. Daniel Hart was gone. Whether it had been a desperate act of escape or a final refusal to face the consequences of his actions, Hart had taken matters into his own hands. As Carter walked back to his car, the full impact of the events began to sink in. Sarah Bellamy was gone, and though justice had been served in some sense, it felt hollow. Ravenswood would never be the same again. The town's innocence had been shattered, and the shadow of what had happened would loom over its streets for years to come. The case had been solved, but the scars left behind would last much longer. For Carter, the weight of the past few days would linger in his mind, and the faces of both Sarah and Hart would stay with him forever, reminders of a tragedy that no one could have predicted.